What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are checking out the T-Mobile REVVL 7 5G. Now, if you aren't already familiar, T-Mobile's REVVL brand is sort of their own in-house smartphone brand. They themselves don't make the hardware. It's actually a company called WingTech, but these REVVL phones are exclusive to both T-Mobile and their prepaid subsidiary Metro. T-Mobile releases a couple of REVVL devices each year. For 2024, they have this regular REVVL 7 and a REVVL 7 Pro that'll have a separate video on. And the REVVL phones tend to be free or highly discounted to entice new and existing customers to sign a service contract. For that very enticing price of free, it's safe to assume a phone like this isn't going to have the greatest specs in the world. This REVVL 7 in particular most closely competes against the cheaper Motorola Moto Gs and the low-tier Samsung A-series devices, basically anything $250 and under. But if you want a big screen smartphone with no frills, no gimmicks, just the simplest Android experience you could possibly imagine, and you're comfortable with T-Mobile as a carrier, then the REVVL might be worth considering. I'm going to fill you in on both the good and the bad, of course, with this phone, but first things first, let's just quickly unbox it so you know what's included. After slicing into the package and sliding off the sleeve, you'll first sift through this very pink package that has a SIM ejector tool, a stack of paperwork, including a quick start guide, and there's also a USB-A to USB-C cable you can use for charging the phone, though I would recommend using a USB-C to USB-C cable, of course, with a proper 15-watt USB-C charging brick. That way you'll get the fastest charging speeds this phone supports. Here is the REVVL 7 itself. It comes in one color, this sort of off-white shade, and that's everything that comes in the box. No charging brick or anything else down in there, unfortunately. So as we get it all booted up, I want to just quickly finish up what I was saying about pricing. This phone is technically $199. That's the full listed price from both T-Mobile and Metro. But whether you're a new or existing customer, if you sign up for a 2-year contract, the phone itself will be free via an $8.34 credit each month. If you cancel that contract, you'll likely have to pay the full price for the phone. So do keep that in mind as you contemplate whether or not this phone is right for you. Now, at a glance, the REVVL 7 probably looks a little jarring to those of us who are used to $1,000 iPhones and Samsungs, but just keep in mind throughout this video that this is supposed to be a simple, free phone, so the design and physical components are going to reflect that. Size-wise, the REVVL 7 is quite big in more ways than one. Its viewable screen, corner to corner, is just shy of 6.6 inches. But obviously, its thick black borders and chunky bottom chin increase its overall size quite a bit. I mean, I can hold the phone just by the bottom bezel and not even touch the display. In the hand, it definitely feels bigger and quite a bit taller than a comparable 6.6-inch smartphone. So I would say that even if you have or are used to like a Samsung A15 or a Motorola G Play, the REVVL 7 is going to look and feel noticeably larger than those, and your thumb is going to get quite the stretch workout. Around back, it shouldn't be a surprise that the REVVL 7 is all plastic, and noticeably so. There's no disguise or fancy finish making it look more premium, though I really don't hate the simplicity. There's just a single T-Mobile T logo, and then for the cameras, there's actually no bump or bulge. The lenses have a small chrome frame around them and a shiny square to break up the design a little, but this is as flat of a phone as can be. The edges are also all plastic and basically match the silvery or off-white shade. The only pop of color you have is a bright pink power button, which I guess is a nice touch. One final note on the build, I can't find any info on water resistance or an IP rating for dusts. There's a rubber grommet around the SIM card tray, which hints at some defense from a splash, but I would maybe be a little more careful around sinks and pools. Speaking of the SIM card tray, this phone also supports a micro SD card if you want to add some storage. It's a 128GB device, which is not bad for a phone like this, especially since literally the only apps that are installed on this thing are the default Android apps and your suite of Google stuff. But there's probably less than 25 total apps here out of the box, which, like I mentioned earlier, is great if you just want something super simple. As for the rest of the hardware, on the right side, you'll find your usual volume buttons and that pink power button, which also doubles as the fingerprint sensor. Waking and unlocking feels perfectly quick, and I didn't have any issues setting it up. Wouldn't really expect that nowadays anyway, but it's a budget phone, so it's worth making sure. And the phone also supports Face Unlock, which is pretty quick too, though not technically the high security standard that some other name brand Android devices have. There is a headphone jack at the bottom, alongside the USB-C port for charging, and this phone also has two speakers, the main one at the bottom, and a secondary one within the earpiece up at the top for a louder, better listening experience. And last but not least, 3 camera lenses around back that you saw, which I'll talk more about in a bit. So as far as the display, I want to make sure I convey the correct information here. This regular REVVL 7 has an IPS LCD screen. The higher tier REVVL 7 Pro has an AMOLED screen, and a few places online list incorrect information, unfortunately. But yeah, this one has an LCD screen, and I think that's pretty obvious when you see it. It's actually a full HD 2408 by 1080 resolution screen, which is great. It looks plenty sharp, even up close. And if you can ignore the bulky black borders, it's a decent viewing experience, especially if you like the extra large size. Digging around in settings, it also claims to be a 120 Hz refresh rate screen, or at least you have the option to enable the smooth display setting, which purports to raise the refresh rate for some content. And I can say that, yeah, the phone generally feels smoother and faster and more responsive with that enabled when you're flicking through some basic stuff, but I can also see the frame rate drop more often than similar supposed dynamic high refresh rate screens, likely due to this phone's lower performance threshold. The big bummer with the viewing experience really is brightness. This is absolutely the dimmest phone I've used so far this year. You basically have to be at a minimum of 80 or 85% brightness, less than 50%, and you're just staring at your own reflection. This isn't an issue that's unique to this phone. Previous REVVLs and other cheap prepaid devices also had dim LCD displays. But it's a tough compromise to make even at this price when you consider where we're at with smartphones nowadays. And also, the screen is what you look at and interact with, so it's odd to sacrifice there when likely there were other ways in which T-Mobile or WingTech could have kept the cost down with a compromise. If you like listening to your content out loud, the dual speaker setup on this phone is, well, quite loud. It has a similar issue as the screen though, where weirdly enough, less than like 50% volume is almost too quiet. The range isn't quite right. And the phone also vibrates a lot around back with anything playing out loud. That's just a product of the plastic housing of the phone. But here's a sound sample so you can maybe get an idea for yourself. As far as the performance, the specs, and the overall user experience, the REVVL 7 is powered by the fairly decent Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 chip, which is an upper mid-range processor originally released in 2022. So it's a couple-year-old component, but it's a name brand, tried and true piece of hardware. It's paired to 6 GB of RAM, which altogether I think is a pretty good foundation for decent performance. Here are the Geekbench numbers, so you can compare with some other smartphones you might already be familiar with. Now, I think the biggest perk with this phone is just the fact that you literally have the most basic, bare bones Android experience out of the box. And I want to make sure I don't understate that. This phone has absolutely nothing more than the core smartphone apps for basic functionality, and then like a dozen of Google's own suite of apps, and that's it. And you can delete some of those. There's not a single reference to REVVL or T-Mobile. You aren't prompted to pre-install LinkedIn or TikTok or Microsoft OneDrive or any of those apps that pay to be on Samsung or Motorola devices, for example. I mean, there's just nothing on this phone out of the box. And for some folks, this is exactly the sort of smartphone experience they're looking for. Absolutely basic necessities and nothing more. However, I think having the bare bones Android experience comes at a slight cost. While there's nothing clogging or cluttering up this phone, there's also nothing here that's optimized for the user experience. Most other Android smartphone manufacturers take the Android OS and try to make it better. Faster, smoother, more visually interesting or unique. They skin it, they optimize it, they update it, and they support it with updates every month or two. And they introduce their own new features alongside major Android updates. With this phone, I mean, it is nothing more than a raw, plain Android experience with no hints whatsoever that REVVL, T-Mobile, or WingTech have done or will do anything to optimize it. And I think for folks who experience some clunkiness or performance issues with this phone, that's probably the the culprit. The phone has all the physical components to perform well, but I think its incredibly basic Android experience doesn't have the OEM touch to make it better for the end user. It's an interesting contrast, and I think it's something to keep in mind when you consider a phone like this. Understand that while the pure basic OS might seem appealing, if you actually use your phone a lot beyond the basic stuff, it may actually not be as friendly of an experience unless you yourself do some of the modding and skidding to Android on your own. But for the handful of people who want nothing more than the 3 or 4 core smartphone apps, I mean, that's literally what you have here. Also powering this phone is a nice sized 5000 milliamp battery. That's the same capacity as most other Samsung and Motorola phones have nowadays, and paired with the mid-tier specs and simple Android OS, I think most people will comfortably get a full day of use out of this phone and probably a bit more. My biggest recommendation really is just making sure you have a 15-watt USB-C wall plug to charge this phone, since that's the maximum speed it supports, and the USB-A cable that's included likely won't get you the power delivery 3.0 or quick charge 3.0 speed that this phone offers. There's no wireless charging on this phone either, which isn't a surprise, and I guess all in all, a bit faster charging speeds would be better, but there's nothing here that's out of the ordinary for this tier of smartphone. Finally, I actually think the biggest compromise with a phone like this is with the cameras. Around back, the REVVL 7 has 3 lenses, but really only one of them is useful. The 50 megapixel main lens is perfectly fine, but to add some faux features, they tossed in a 2 megapixel depth sensor and a 2 megapixel macro lens, neither of which nowadays is relevant when you consider how much camera software plays a role in image processing. The selfie camera is also just an 8 megapixel lens, and this is one of those phones that doesn't even offer selfie portrait pics for some odd reason. It's just not something you can do, which is a pretty big indication that the camera setup as a whole is quite basic. You have 10 times zoom, night mode, slow-mo video, panorama, and hyperlapse, and I kid you not, that's basically every camera feature or mode that's here. The macro lens for up-close pictures is as worthless as it's ever been. Google Lens pre-installed is fine, but not necessary. The 50 megapixel picture mode and pro controls won't ever be used by most people on this phone, and there's a couple other random camera settings that you can opt into. But like I said, this phone just sort of gives you the camera because it has to. The pictures are going to look a little funky. They're blurry, but somehow still over-processed. Very much a budgety look, and with a phone like this, I often say that if pictures and videos are something that's important to you, most other smartphones from the big OEMs have so much more to offer for not a whole lot more money, like Samsung's A35, for example. And it's probably well worth considering those instead of this. So here's the deal with the REVVL 7. This is a phone you can get for free, and that delivers just the most basic, bare bones, and core essential smartphone experience for the folks who want simplicity, who just need to stay connected to the world, and who use their phones only for the basics. There's probably not a better option out there. For everyone else, this is probably not the best value, all things considered, but I like the fact that it's offered as an option, and I can see it appealing to enough people to where T-Mobile keeps offering the REVVL brand each year. Sometimes you just want a phone that's cheap and simple, and that's exactly what you get with the REVVL 7. But what do you guys think? Is there anything that's appealing about this phone to you? If you have this one or a different REVVL phone, I'd love to hear about your experience with it, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.